We're going to be in Acts 21. And again, if you're visiting, there's outlines on the tables with our 50th coming up. I'll be recycling the extra ones, so if you want to check for any past ones that are there, there's actually more on this one over here if you want to pick any up that you may have missed. Today is going to be the ending of the third missionary journey, and roughly, and I just put it on the outline, Paul's going to go literally from the far west coast of Asia Minor, of Turkey, and he's going to go to Jerusalem. And the significance of what's about to happen is that by the time he comes to Jerusalem, he will be falsely charged, he will be arrested, will be in prison in Caesarea for 2 years. There will be another journey, they'll make the trip to Rome, and he'll be in prison for another 2 years. And so today is a major transition in terms of just personal activity, being able to do things. And one of the things that we'll close with is that this section is a transition from him being a free person, being able to travel, start churches, and do things. And he's going to begin, and I don't mean this so much as a pun, but it's true, he's going to begin a prison ministry. This is terribly silly, but it's still true. If you grow up in a small town, the gym, basketball gym, is available most of the time. You can get a key and get in. In fact, Daryl's uncle, the older Davis, Frank, they live far enough out in the country, he would catch a ride with the postman into town, crawl up on the porch, crawl through the window, shoot baskets for 2 hours, and the postman would come and knock on the door, and then he would take him home. And so in small towns, you can get in and out of these gyms all the time. Well, in Sayre, if you just not quite know how to hold your mouth and do it quite right, you can lift that back door of the junior high gym and get in and, know where the lights are and everything. Well, I've been in Australia, been gone, the high school's torn down, and I'm home for a visit, and I think I'll just go to the gym and shoot a few baskets. And sure enough, no one had changed Greg wasn't there to change the locks on the door. And the third time, the door opened. So I close the door, and I go in, and here's some guy in blue shirts, and they've got numbers on the side of them, but I'm just thinking, they're probably working, for the school or something. And the west end of the gym's not very good, so I'm on the east end and just shooting away, and all of a sudden, here's this little man in a suit with a badge. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm shooting baskets in the Sayre Junior High gym." He said, "Let's try the Sayre Correctional Facility." Having been gone for all these years, I didn't go to the front because I knew how to get in the door in the back, and I wasn't able to see the sign Sayre Correctional Facility on the front end. So I have broken into the Sayre Correctional Facility, and he said, "How did you get here?" And I said, "Well, I went to school here, and I obviously know how to get in here." And he said, "We're going to play Let's Make a Deal." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You're going to make 3 baskets, and I'm going to walk through that door, and however you came, you're going to leave, and you were never here, right? You didn't sign in, you were never here." So I told Sheila, I says, "Well, I nearly started a prison ministry because I broke into the Sayre Correctional Facility not knowing what it was." But seriously, on Paul's part, and we'll read this in a little bit, that initial conversation on the road to Damascus has so many different dimensions and so much significance. But one of those things is, "Ananias, he is my chosen instrument. I want you to tell him how much he will suffer." And again, we're going to read one of those short lists that's not that short of the suffering. "And he will be my witness to Gentiles," and then here it comes, "and to kings." And Paul would have had no idea on the road to Damascus that fulfillment of what Ananias told him is going to be, and he literally will use this expression, while he's in chains. So this is why this section, and while it's a travel narrative and it's a journey, and it's going to be a long trip from the far side of Asia Minor to get all the way back to Jerusalem, This is also, and of course, Paul doesn't know this at this particular time because this is just the activity that's going on, but this is a major transition between being the free person, going to different areas, starting churches, all the activities that have been a part of his ministry. That's about to totally change. And so that's a part of what's going to continue on in our future lessons. So our aim is just very simple. We're going to describe how Paul's call to preach before kings is going to begin in Jerusalem. And that will take us into the next few weeks. But let's read, first of all, in Acts chapter 9. And this is just my term. I like the term job description from this point of view. Yes, God calls Ananias, and very appropriately, he's reluctant. It's like, Lord, haven't you heard? And the Lord says, yes, I know that. But notice what Ananias is told to do in Acts 9:13. Paul is still blind, but here's what he is told. Lord, I have heard from many about this man and how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on your name. But the Lord said to him, and isn't this just a fabulous expression? Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine. One of our teachers in Memphis was a former Marine, and that just kind of comes with a certain mindset. And he was talking about Peter one day, and he said, it's much easier to redirect motivation and energy than it is to create it from someone who's lethargic and not doing anything. And he said, you watch how Jesus is going to redirect the energy of Peter toward becoming the apostle. And then he just quietly said, and he's going to do the same thing with Paul. He said, nobody in their right mind, while he's still Saul of Tarsus, would have thought, oh, yeah, this is going to be the guy who writes 13 letters in the New Testament. No, he's in the business of, holding the garments, having Stephen stoned, putting Christians in jail. He's just doing everything he can to destroy the church. And God says, now that one right there, he is a chosen instrument of mine. And here are these three things. He will carry my name before the Gentiles. And notice how often does Paul describe himself as the apostle to the Gentiles and kings, and that's going to be the transition into the last quarter of the book of Acts, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. This word must is very interesting. As Luke writes it, it's just three little letters, D-E-I, de, but must. Men and brethren, what must we do to be saved? And you'll just hear it. This is one of Luke's terms that he uses. But there's also a sense of divine compulsion. There's a sense of this is God's will. This is what God is wanting to accomplish. And here's what's so amazing is that, like I said, no one in the church would ever have thought, yes, and the guy who is persecuting us is going to become our primary preacher, evangelist, and the one who encourages the church so much. I just did some samples of these, but notice as Paul writes these letters through the years, and first of all, it's going to be in Acts, but notice how often he will just say, I persecuted the church. And that was something that, let me just say it this way. For as many nights as he spends in prison, I just wonder how often it might have crossed his mind. Earlier, he was the one who had put Christians in prison. That's what he's doing on the Damascus Road. He has orders to go from Jerusalem all the way up, and he's going to locate, bind, incarcerate, put Christians in prison, and then of all things, here he himself is going to be in prison much later. So Acts 22:4, I persecuted this, and we looked at the term earlier, the way, and that's one of Luke's descriptions of the church through parts of the book of Acts. I persecuted this way to death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. Acts 26:11. I punished them often in all the synagogues. I tried to make them blaspheme, and in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. So Paul's going to be in the business of trying to locate as many Christians as he can in the area around Jerusalem, Judea. But hey, let's head to foreign cities. There's Christians in those places as well, and these are all a part of the activities of Saul of Tarsus. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9, I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. Galatians 1:13, you heard about my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently. And look at this term, I tried to destroy it. And let's go ahead and read another couple more and then just kind of look at that. Just kind of shudder when you read this. As to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church. And even when he writes to Timothy, 1 Timothy 1:13, formerly, I was a blasphemer, a persecutor, and I don't like words in our translations that I don't use the word insolent. You may use the word insolent. I don't use the word insolent. So when I have a word in my translation I don't use, I find one literally and write an appropriate one in. This doesn't help a whole lot, but American Standard says injurious. New American Standard said a violent aggressor. But the NIV just simply says a violent man. Now you just read through these, and again, it's easy kind of to gloss over this as you read through the book of Acts. But here is someone who is focused, here's someone who's determined, and he has a very clear purpose in life while he's Saul of Tarsus before the road to Damascus. And what were those terms? I persecuted them in foreign cities. I persecuted them violently. I tried to destroy it, and I was a violent man. But here's what becomes interesting after the road to Damascus. And to make the contrast, we're going to just say Saul of Tarsus on this side, Paul on the other side. And there's just going to be this complete 180 total change. And so the first thing is he goes through this transition from being the persecutor to being the one who is being persecuted. And in many ways, those who were in Judaism would virtually view him as a traitor, because he was one of us, and whatever could have gotten in his mind to now be with them. And so 2 Timothy 3:12, he will just say, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And I left some other passages for you to look at later. So not only is he persecuted, then he also becomes a preacher and a proclaimer. And Galatians 1:23, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith. And see, here it is. He once tried to destroy. I mean, he is adamant, he's focused, he's single-minded, and just doing everything he can to destroy the church. When we lived in Sydney, like I said, in terms of Oklahoma City, it's like we lived in Newcastle. We were either the last little town out or the first one coming into town. And this is still crazy, but the international airport that's close to the ocean is shut down from 12 o'clock till 6 a.m. regardless. You just cannot land at all. And that just creates all kinds of difficulties, which we won't even get into. So for years, they have been talking about, we're going to build a new airport, we're going to build a new airport. And any area that was possibly designated, then these signs would come up, and here would be an airplane, and then the word stupid. It's plain stupid to build the airport in our area. And it was just, for whatever reason, and too much noise and on it goes. I tend to think, man, you look at the jobs and the activity and the other stuff, but that was not even talked about. There was a guy who got so involved in preventing the airport from coming to our area that he lost his job, he lost his family, and he lost his house. He just became consumed with fighting the coming in of this airport, and he was one of the main ones that put all in everything, council, you just list everything going on, and he was just so single-minded, and this is plain stupid for an airport to come into our area. It just took over his life. Well, you look at Saul, before the road to Damascus, he is single-minded and he's focused, and he is potentially the next leading mind in Judaism. Remember who's his instructor? He sat at the feet of Gamaliel, who's one of the brightest minds in Judaism in the first century. He potentially is the next successor to Gamaliel within Judaism, and his whole focus prior to the Damascus Road is destroy this thing called the church, the way, and whatever violence and other things need to be done, then that was a part of it. And then he becomes a preacher for it. I said this when we were going through this, but I'm very empathetic with the church in Jerusalem not running to him when they first hear he becomes a Christian and he visits Jerusalem. Let's use one of our terms. I would be saying, make sure he doesn't get a church directory. We don't want him to know. It's bad enough if he knows who a few of us are, but don't give this guy a church directory. And Barnabas was the one, but it's understandable. You know, these people may either have had relatives in prison or maybe have been killed, and it's just hard to imagine that the guy who's so focused in destroying the church is now going to become the preacher and the proclaimer. But then this is going to be our transition through the latter part of the book of Acts. He is also going to go from being a persecutor to a prisoner. And we're going to see the term far more imprisonments is a term that is going to be used here. But quickly, here's the time. Acts 24:17, anticipate. 2 years had elapsed. Felix was succeeded by Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Then he's going to make the journey to Rome. We're going to have another shipwreck, and the book of Acts is going to end. Oh, he lived in Rome for 2 whole years at his own expense, and he welcomed all who came to him. And here's a part again of this mission of preaching the gospel to kings. And we mentioned this earlier in another section, so we'll do it quickly. But notice, while he's in prison in Rome for that 2 years, it has become known throughout the whole, some translations will say imperial guard, the whole praetorium, that my imprisonment is for Christ. And we hear these repeated references to chains, and these guys are going to be chained to Paul and a whole group of people. And my explanation is for us, if you know anything about the SEALs and the Rangers, that's who the Imperial Guard is. That's who the Praetorium is. And these are Caesar's closest devoted troops. And while they're not out in the provinces, they're not out fighting battles, they're in Rome. And a whole group of these guys are going to hear the gospel because of this imprisonment. When you look at the next page, in addition, Philippians 4:22, those of Caesar's household. And because he has made the appeal to go to Caesar, Caesar's household is the first civil service that ever existed. And Paul's going to be able to have contact with a whole group of these people. But here's the expression. Notice Ephesians 6:20. I am an ambassador in chains. And isn't that just an irony within itself? We typically don't think of sending our ambassador to England and he being in chains. And yes, I know this is a spiritual comment, but he says, for Christ, I am an ambassador in chains. Pray for me that I may declare boldly as I ought to speak. Similar, Colossians 4:18, remember my chains. Then he's going to be set free for a period of time. We don't know what takes place. And the big question that we talked about last week or previously, remember when he writes to the church in Rome, he says, I want to come to you and have you to send me on to Spain. And so when we close the book of Acts in a few weeks, then he will be in Rome in house arrest for 2 years. We're not able to know what happened, what took place with the legal process, but apparently he's free for a period of time. During that period of time, he's going to send Timothy to Ephesus. He's going to send Titus to Crete. There's going to be some type of freedom and some type of activity. And then the very last word we hear is 2 Timothy, and he's incarcerated again. But he's very confident this is the last time. And you remember that expression? The time of my departure is at hand. Fought the good fight, kept the faith, completed the race. And that's why he tells Timothy quickly, and also because winter's coming and the shipping's going to close down, you go get John Mark. And so the final word that we're going to hear from him, and this is 2 Timothy 2:16, may the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. And when you read through this, Onesimus, that's not the right word, Onesiphorus, he made a diligent search. And you think Rome is the largest city in the whole empire, and where's Paul? And this man searched diligently until he found him and refreshed him. And then he says, I am suffering, I am bound with chains as a criminal. The word of God is not bound. This is just one of those passages that just kind of needs to register in the back of our minds. And I just think of this very often, and there's even more to it than here. But here's 2 Corinthians 11, starting with 23. And what is taking place in 2 Corinthians from 10 to 13, there are a group, and Paul either will call them the false apostles, the super apostles, those who are hypercritical of Paul in the city of Corinth. And he says, and they're boasting about they can do this and they can do that. But Paul says, if I will boast in my weaknesses. And he will also then talk about the suffering that he has undertaken at this time. And what I want you to notice is that 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans are written in 55 to 56. And Paul may have maybe even up to another decade of his life. And so a whole lot more is going to happen after this, but this is from the Damascus Road toward the end of the second missionary journey. Here are things that have happened to Paul. And he just says, 11:23 of 2 Corinthians, with far greater laborers, and then notice this, far more imprisonments. And so this isn't just one or two. And what we have in the book of Acts is that we have the historical narrative of a few of the events, but there's a whole group of things that we don't know anything about. Countless beatings, often near death. And then you look at this expression, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. And you start reading through Acts and you get to thinking, we don't know about the most of these. And so that's what I'm saying. Acts gives us kind of a window. It gives us a sliver. But look at all the other details that Paul goes through. 5 times I was received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. We know about that one. But what took place? They drug him outside the city and they stoned him, and they what? Oh, they left him for dead. And he may even have been unconscious for a period of time. And then, just think about this, 3 times I was shipwrecked, and a night and a day I have spent in the deep. And here's what's significant. This is before the journey to Rome. So as we read through the book of Acts, and we read about the coming shipwreck on the way to Rome that's going to happen in a few chapters, this is going to be shipwreck number 4. So do you see what I'm saying? There's just a whole group of things in the life of Paul that he suffered, that we just have just a very small window of those from the book of Acts. This is 11:26. I was on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, from robbers, from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea. This is the one that would scare me. Danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure, and apart from these other things, and I would say physical things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. If I must boast, I will boast in the things that show my weakness. Let me process and think how to say this without, I want to say something that's hard to say without trying to be offensive, but let me just talk about myself. I'm pretty confident that none of us have suffered a fraction of these types of things. Can I say it like that? And I'm not making light of our difficulties. I'm not making light of our burdens and things. But sometimes it's helpful when I'm struggling with something to stop and read 2 Corinthians 11, by the time I get through, I think, I didn't have any real big problems at all compared to this. And that's why, and this is not in Scripture, this is just my personal description, a lot of times he's a walking scar. I mean, what do they do when they beat you with lashes? They strip you down, and I mean, you just imagine your back trying to heal from that, and the rods and the stoning and all this other stuff. But what did Ananias say? Here are the things you must suffer. And that catalog is very, very important. So here's Paul's job description, and we'll be coming to this in Acts 26. He says in verse 9, I was convinced I ought to do many things and impose in the name of Jesus. And when he's on the road, he gives this account in Acts 26:15. I am Jesus who you are persecuting. Arise and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you for this purpose, a servant, a witness. I will deliver you from your own people who I'm sending you. And this always strikes me. After the road to Damascus, what takes place the first 3 days? He's blind and he can't see. And the Lord says to him, and you think about, if you're blind for 3 days, you're going to have some time to think about this. I want you to open their eyes. And so the physical blindness that he encounters when he first meets Jesus on the road is incorporated into his spiritual job description. And as the apostle to the Gentiles, then I want you to open their eyes. I want you to turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified. And he says, Agrippa, I was not disobedient to that vision. If you turn the page, we're not going to read all of these, but I just gave a list. There's nearly 10 times that either Christ, an angel, or God speaks to Paul in addition to the road to Damascus. And I'll leave you to look at that. But just, like for example, he comes into Corinth, and what's he told? Oh, don't be afraid. Speak up. I have many people in this city. Macedonian call. Come over to Macedonia and help us. All through his life, it's punctuated by different visions and things that take place. Let's read in Acts 21. And I just highlighted the word we and us again because, and this isn't self-promoting, but Dr. Luke, there are certain sections typically called the we sections in Acts. And there are times, as he says in the opening of the gospel, I talked with eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Well, there's sections of Acts where Luke is with him, and this is one of these we sections, and notice what took place, the journey from Ephesus to Jerusalem. When we had parted from them, 21:1, we set sail, we came to a straight course, and here's Cos and Rhodes and Patera. We found a ship crossing to Phoenicia, and we went aboard and set sail. Most of these, as we're going to see, most of these ships are going to be either cargo or military. Reading about our missionaries in Africa early in the last century, one of the families I read about, they stayed in Africa for 15 years before they made their first trip home. Claudia, can you imagine moving to Africa and staying for 15 years before you come home for the first time? And what do? Oh, well, you go down to whether it's Johannesburg or somewhere, and you find a ship going to England, and they couldn't do advanced booking. And then once you get to England, then you wait and you try to find a ship that's going either to New York or somewhere across. And they worked their way across, but they stayed for 15 years. They came home for a visit. The next time they stayed for 9 years. I can't even imagine, don't have telephone, all this stuff. And one of the return trips is during the war when German U-boats are out. So this time then they go to the Caribbean and then go down to South America and then cross over to try not to get sunk by a German U-boat. These were amazing people. Well, how do you get from Ephesus back to Palestine? You find either a cargo, a transit ship, and then you go from one place to another, and this is how Paul's going to get back there. We set sail. We came to the side of Cyprus. We sailed to Syria, landed at Tyre. We unloaded. Having sought for the disciples, searched for. So we're going to stop. They're going to unload the cargo because that's the ship that they're on. And we stayed for 7 days. Through the Spirit, they're telling Paul not to go to Jerusalem. We departed. We went on our journey. The wives and the children accompanied us till we went outside the city. Kneeling down on the beach, we prayed. We said farewell to one another. We boarded the ship, and they returned home. And then they're going to go to Tyre and then Ptolemais. They greet the brothers and stay with them. The next day we departed. We came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip. Remember the Ethiopian? And so here's Philip, possibly 20 years later. He has 4 daughters. He's one of the 7 who prophesied. We stayed there for many days. A prophet, Agabus, came. He took Paul's belt. He bound his feet and hands. Thus says the Holy Spirit, this is how the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and will deliver him to the Gentiles. When we heard this, and the people there, we urged him not to go to Jerusalem. And Paul says, no, I'm going to go. And they just say, well, let the Lord's will be done. And we got up, we went to Jerusalem, and we came to Jerusalem, and the brothers received us gladly. So if you look at the back page, we'll highlight a couple of things. Wherever Paul travels, he locates people in the church. And that's one of the things our families tried to do. Anytime like our kids were at home, we went to Carlsbad and went to church on Wednesday night, and our middle one's our most articulate. She says, Dad, since we're visiting, do we have to turn the lights off here like we do at home? And I says, oh, no, we're visitors. Don't worry about it. We literally had stepped foot in the parking lot, and 3 teenagers come by and says, hey, come to class with us. We went and had a devotional. They had class. We didn't see our kids. Well, they got in a discussion with those 3 kids. We turned the lights off. We were the last ones to leave. And our expression was, wherever we go, we have the blessing of meeting part of God's family we haven't met before. And even in this transit, even in this transition, wherever Paul stops, oh, let's go find the disciples, let's find the church. A student of the New Testament has counted 91 names in the New Testament. And he made this comment, the vast majority of the people we know by name in the New Testament, we know because they're associated with Paul. Isn't that interesting? The persecutor who's killing, incarcerating, and trying to destroy the church, the majority of the people that we know in the New Testament by name, we know because they were associated with Paul. There's a list, and we'll do the highlights of this, but look at the parallels between the trial of Jesus and what's going to happen in terms of the trial of Paul. Both will be delivered to the Gentiles. There's a journey to Jerusalem. Initially, they're well received. Both are going to go to the temple. Both are going to discuss the resurrection, and the Sadducees and the Pharisees are going to split. Each is a victim of mob violence. Each of them are going to hear, away with this man, let's be done with him. Paul and Jesus are both going to have 4 different hearings or trials, and you'll see this with Jesus, Sanhedrin, Pilate, Herod, Pilate, Paul, Sanhedrin, Felix, Festus, Agrippa, and each is declared innocent by government officials. Interesting little quote. The world did not see the babe in the manger readily was, and when it did, or who he was, and when it did, the trouble began. Scarcely had Jesus finished his first sermon in his hometown before they were crying for his blood and wanting to cast him off the nearest cliff. His sober warning about his disciples will be treated likewise receives its fulfillment in the life of Paul. And basically, if this is how they've treated the master, this is how they're going to treat his disciples. And the multitude of suffering that Paul is going to endure was anticipated by Jesus. But I thought this was true. Look at the irony. Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day, tribe of Benjamin. Here is just Jewish to the core, but through his life, the Jews are his strongest opposition over and over and over and again, and it's going to be the Romans who protect him, and even when they're trying to kill him in a few verses in Jerusalem, the Romans are going to protect him. So here's the end. The 3rd missionary journey, when they get back, is going to be finished. The coming events will send Paul to Rome, and he traveled as a free man throughout the Eastern Roman Empire, And God is now going to use his incarceration to do things he never could do as a free man. Last thought, I know we need to leave. Our guys at Eastside went to a prison on Sundays for years, 20-some years. One of the guys in the prison, while he was free, on the way home had stopped at a bar. A guy made a smart comment, and he said, I just whacked him in the chin, and he fell over backwards, hit his head on a wooden stool, and killed him. And he just said, I talked to him 2 or 3 times, and he said, he said, that was the best thing that ever happened to me because I was so much in the world, I would never have time to have heard the gospel. But because I ended up in prison, then the guys from your church taught me the gospel, and while I'll spend my physical life in prison, I'll spend eternity in heaven. And he said, I will always be thankful for what God was able to do with me and through me because I became incarcerated. And if you're on the road to Damascus, could you ever have imagined the years, if you're Saul, that you're going to spend in prison, but look at the things that God is going to do with him and through him, even in the most unexpected circumstances. And what God does with Saul, he can do with you and I as well.